Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us, above us only sky. Imagine all the people living for today. Imagine there's no countries. It isn't hard to do. Nothing to kill or die for, and no religion too. Imagine all the people living life in peace. You might say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. Hope someday you'll join us, and the world will live as one. Imagine no possessions. I wonder if you can. No need for greed or hunger. A brotherhood of man. Imagine all the people sharing all the world. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us, and the world will live as one.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome. And some people may be joining us for the first time and picking up last evening's session on the recording. So I just want to take a moment and from the bottom of my heart, welcome everyone to this Friday morning in the U.S. session of the International Conference of Contemplative Outreach. And our theme is the global embrace, our widening reach, and our deepening connection. And it really brought home to me our widening reach when yesterday after our session, Billy from Philippines said, "Thank you for playing our postcard." And then she said, "Good night to you. It's good morning to me." And so wherever you are in this globe, we embrace you and we welcome you and ask you to embrace and welcome us because we're in this together as a contemplative outreach community. We all belong because of our practice of centering prayer. And I just want to take a little moment to review our theme because I think it is so powerful that during the next sessions, we will be exploring our widening reach and our deepening connection. So we'll start this session, right now, reaching out to St. Benedict's Monastery, which Thomas Keating told us, or very nicely wrote into the vision statement, that under the guideline for service, that we maintain a spiritual relationship with St. Benedict's Monastery in Snowmass, Colorado. Guideline for Service 10. And so we thought a good way to start this morning was to ask Abbot Charlie if he would give us a few words. So I think I forgot two very important announcements. Let me just backtrack a minute. We're recording this, so if you don't want to be visible on the recording, just stop your video. Otherwise, sometimes the people who are here will appear on the video. So if that's okay with you, then you can keep your video going. And the second really important announcement is that you should have an updated version of Zoom so that you can keep the transmission going. You don't get interrupted in any way. So there was a slide that showed you how to update if you haven't done that. But those are two, I guess when we were live, we'd say they were housekeeping announcements. So I guess they're kind of our Zoom keeping announcements. And so now I'll just take a moment to tell you about Abbot Charlie. He became the abbot of St. Benedict's Monastery in 2019. And on August 10th, when the Denver bishop blessed and confirmed him as the abbot, Abbot Charlie described life in the monastery by saying, "Our life is one of prayer and hospitality and community." And we are so grateful for that connection there. The many people who have gone and continue to go on retreats at the retreat center and to connect with the monastery through the Sunday liturgies. And so right this minute, we're going to connect with a video with Abbot Charlie welcoming us.
Hello, friends at Contemplative Outreach. Father Charlie Albanese here, the abbot of St. Benedict's Monastery, welcoming you during this time to support your ongoing spiritual journey and contemplative prayer. Our prayers will be with you as you begin these days, and remember the connection that we have over these many years with Contemplative Outreach and St. Benedict's Monastery. Our world has really changed since the start of the pandemic, adding to the anxiety that our world already carries. Contemplative Outreach has also changed, and St. Benedict's Monastery has changed, and we all do not know how life will be in the foreseeable future, but we do have hope. As I was thinking about the unpredictability of all of life's changes, I do realize that our prayer to God over all these years is very much with us. Life does change, and our prayer changes with us. We are not separate from God or from one another. From my own experience, even in the monastery, prayer remains a real connection and a life-giving practice, whether it is guests participating in a retreat at the retreat house or living our day-to-day activities in the world. We want to stay connected to the presence of God in our lives and in one another. So as you participate in this conference, let us continue to pray for one another and for the entire world we live in and for the earth itself. I hope and pray that everyone keeps safe, stays well, and wherever you are, and as you share your practice and experience with others, we all will continue to share this great gift of prayer and hope and service to all. God bless you all, and I wish you a good conference.
So I don't know how much he knew he was going to introduce us to our next speaker, but I am so grateful for his words of connection and life-giving and the power of prayer. And before I introduce Julie Saad, who will be giving us the main address for this conference or this session, I want to let everyone know that at the end of Julie's presentation, we will go into small breakout rooms. Yesterday it was 6 people, so I'm guessing that's where we'll be. And this is the opportunity we have to continue the conversation. And we'll be doing this after the next 3 or 4 general sessions, so that the conversation will be ongoing. After each session, we'll talk about what we heard in that session, what rang in our hearts loud and clear, and where we feel the Spirit prompting us about our own lives and about the future of centering prayer and contemplative outreach. So we're looking internally and forward. And so just to let you know that after Julie's presentation, you'll have a chance to share with 5 other people, and then we'll come back to the whole group. And that's another chance to share in the conversation, and there will be 2 ways. You can raise your hand and be able to just share right out loud what rose up for you. But if you prefer, you can put it in the chat, and the chat will be recorded, and we will keep that information, because as contemplative outreach promised, the conversation is continuing. We're building on what people have been sending in from the summer conversations, but this is a continuation of that. And the whole community is invited to participate. So let me introduce Julie Saad. So Julie has been a part of contemplative outreach since 1994. And she is the coordinator of the Contemplative Living Experience Program in Denver, Colorado. And she has been serving on the Contemplative Outreach Governing Board for almost 5 years. She is the board representative on the Gift Committee, which is the group responsible for the Father Keating legacy that's archived at Emory University. Julie is just finishing writing her book, Contemplative Living, Discovering Our Path into the Heart of God. It'll be published very soon. This book explores how our God of love transforms our lives through the practice of contemplative prayer, so that we become an expression of God's love in the world. And it's not surprising that that's going to be the theme of her presentation. How our God of love transforms us so that we become an expression of God's love in the world. So let us listen with the ear of our heart as she shares with us.
Am I on now? Okay. You can hear me?
I can hear you, Julie, but I see me in the speaker.
Yeah. Okay.
There you go.
Okay. So, well, good day, everybody, and welcome and thank you for being here. Before I really start the presentation and pull up my slides, I wanted to tell you a little story that came to me this morning. I just got back a little while ago from walking my dog, Joey, and I couldn't help but notice that fall is in the air today in Colorado. And so this is the first summer day when you start to get a hint of the changing season. And this particular season change reminds me that we are approaching next month the 3-year anniversary of the deaths of both Father Thomas and Abbot Joseph. And so I was thinking about this because this summer in June, I was up at the monastery, and I was standing on Father Thomas's grave, looking out over the Sacred Valley towards Mount Sopris, and I had this thought. I kind of said this to Father Thomas: wow, you have a much better view from up here than you did from the periodical room. If anybody's ever been there, you know what I'm talking about. And so while I was standing there missing his physical presence, still missing, I told him that I was going to do everything I could to further his teaching and to keep it alive in our world. And so then I went back to Carbondale and was with some friends later that morning, and they said to me, so what did Father Thomas say anything to you? And I said, yeah, he told me I probably should say yes to speaking at this conference. And so here I am. And I just want to say how honored and humbled. And I'm trying to get all this emotional stuff kind of out of the way so that I can talk, because I have a lot to share with you today. I was thinking about what Abbot Charlie was saying about how everything is changing. And, that's always true in life. And I think maybe we're even more aware of it in these days that we're living in. And, but he also said that we have great hope because of our continued sharing of this prayer, this gift that we've all been given. And so I want to say that my hope for you today is that you'll find some little nugget of what I have to share that you can take into your heart that gives you hope on your journey. And so give me just a minute now to get my slides up here. So I just want to check in again with Carol. Everything look okay? I'm taking
Yes,
that.
it looks great.
Okay, good. Success. Okay, so let me start with what God promises us from Ezekiel. I will give you a new heart, and a new spirit I will put within you. I will remove the heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. what it means to me to live a contemplative life has been a topic that I've been pondering for many years, as I'm sure many of you have. Because I think what it means to me has changed over time as my commitment to centering prayer and its effects in my daily life has deepened. And this has led me more recently to spend more time thinking about action as it relates to contemplative life, mostly because I think sometimes people think about contemplative outreach and what we do is not having much to do with action. But about a month ago, I started thinking about this talk as being about transformation in action. And I hope to unpack what that means to me for you today. So in this quote from Fruits and Gifts of the Spirit, Father Thomas says, "What are you really doing when you sit down in centering prayer and open yourself to God's presence and action within you? You are opening to God's presence and consenting to God's activity. God's activity is the work of the Holy Spirit in your particular embodiment in the world." In our first centering prayer guideline, as you know, we say that our sacred word is a symbol of our intention to consent to God's presence and action within. And I think in the early years of practice, we tend to focus more on God's presence within, which I think is normal because a lot of us come to centering prayer without an experience of God's presence within, and maybe even with some disbelief about the whole concept of a God within. It's through the practice, through the deepening of the relationship, the spiritual consolations, and the experience of love that we come to know God's presence within. But God calls us to come even closer. And that's where we come to know God's action within. It starts with what Father Thomas calls divine therapy, with the unloading of the unconscious, the dark nights we inevitably experience, so that the divine light within can shine forth. It's when we consent to God's action within that transformation takes hold in us. So I'm going to be asking you throughout our time together to consider your own experience. So I hope through what I'm offering that you'll be able to see the movement in your life from how your consent to God's action within leads to your transformation, which leads to the action of the Spirit through you into the world, into your ordinary daily life. Notice how in the quote, Father Thomas says we're opening to God's presence and consenting to God's activity. I can remember him talking about God's action, the work of the Spirit in our lives, as something that we have a choice about. We can consent, or God will wait for us if we're not ready to consent. Our God is very patient and loving that way. But you know, we all move off the cushion, out of our prayer chair, into daily life, so that everything that we do once we've committed to this process of transformation is divine action in the world. As many of you know, over the years, we've spent a lot of time talking about and working on the contemplative outreach vision, but we never really talked about a mission for our organism. And a few years before he died, Father Thomas updated the vision and added commentaries. I think he knew that we wouldn't have him much longer, and to ask him questions, because people were always consulting with him. And so I think the commentaries were to help us with that time when we would no longer have him. And so he added this commentary to the first theological principle, which is basically a mission statement. The fundamental purpose of centering prayer and of contemplative outreach is to further the knowledge and experience of God's love in the consciousness of the human family. I've read this many times over the last few years, but for some reason, about a year ago, it seemed to take on new meaning for me, almost as if I was really seeing it for the first time. It's become my why for the service that I do for contemplative outreach, my mission and my purpose. And I think over time that most of us discover through the process of transformation that's part of this way of life, that we've indeed become a channel of God's love in the world. I wanted to tell you how I came to be interested in contemplative life as a topic. As you know, Carol was mentioning, I spent the last 6 years working on writing a book on the Contemplative Living Experience program. It's a program that we hold in Denver that's modeled after the original 9-month course that was created by the spiritual community at Chrysalis House under the guidance of Father Thomas. So in addition to writing the book, in 2017, I was invited to be part of a team to help figure out how to fulfill one of Father Thomas's final wishes for contemplative outreach. And that was to make the Spiritual Journey series video course more accessible to our worldwide community. And I ended up being one of the writers and co-facilitators of a year-long online course to update the series. And I just have to tell you, I just got the news like within the last hour that all of that work that we did for that online course is now available on Contemplative Outreach's website. And so somebody will put a link to that at some point, and you'll be able to go and see what it is that we've done. And it's available for free for everyone. So anyway, I think this is probably true for most writers. In order to be able to write about something, especially something as important to me as Thomas Keating's teaching, I had to study it and understand it. And so working on the book and on the online program gave me the opportunity to be more deeply immersed in Father Thomas's teaching. And really, all of this, the book, this presentation, a similar workshop I did in Denver in May, all are an homage to Father Thomas, my teacher and mentor. As I was working on that year-long course and the book, I started seeing some recurring themes or concepts in Father Thomas's teaching that seemed important to me. And I started spending more time reflecting on these, not only to come to a deeper understanding, but also to notice how they applied to my life and if I was really living them. So these are the things I want to offer to you today for your reflection. You'll find him referring to these themes in many places in his writing and videos. And so I've just picked out 1 or 2 quotes for each. And I'm going to go into the full quote and more detail with each one. But I think these concepts point us to what it means to live a contemplative life, and also the movement we experience of transformation in action. So I want to ask, when you were learning centering prayer, do you remember hearing anyone say the fruits of centering prayer are experienced in daily life, not in the actual prayer period? As time goes on, I think we start to recognize the truth in that statement, but it reminds me of all the times over the years when I would hear people judging their practice by, whether they were experiencing a peaceful, consoling prayer period, which they judged as good, versus having a barrage of thoughts for the whole 20 minutes, bad. They were not yet realizing that it doesn't matter what happens during the prayer period, because regardless, the effects are experienced in daily life. Father Thomas talked about daily life all the time. So he not only encouraged a daily practice of centering prayer, but also the other practices for daily living, like the welcoming prayer, the active prayer, Lectio Divina. And I think these quotes that I've picked out on this slide provide three different aspects of how he talked about daily life. The first has to do with fidelity to our commitments in daily life as our primary spiritual practice. And so you might think about how fidelity to your commitments in daily life is a spiritual practice for you. What are the commitments you have in your daily life? Such things as your work, your family, maybe a spouse or partner, children, parents. You may be a caregiver to a family member. What about your friends, your community, your neighborhood? If you've made a commitment to any of these people or groups, how do you approach them? It can be a challenge to approach commitments and responsibilities with joy and kindness and even compassion, rather than as an obligation. So, do you feel good about your approach to your commitments in daily life? And if not, how might you change it? So the second quote is similar. Daily life is practice number one. The contemplative dimension of the gospel perceives in daily life the treasures of holiness hidden in the most trivial and mundane events. So how often do you think of your daily life as trivial and mundane? And has that changed for you over time as your centering prayer practice has deepened? And can you think of the treasures of holiness that might be hidden in your daily life? So one of the treasures that I've become more aware of, and if you know me, this won't surprise you, but it has to do with my dog, Joey. So I take her to the dog park every day, and I have been for 5 years. I rescued her when she was about 5 months old. Same dog park, same people, same dogs every day. And regardless of how I may feel about being at the dog park every day, it gives Joey great joy. I'm mostly just trying to walk a mile while I'm there, but she's making sure that everybody in the park feels properly greeted, people and dogs. Some people call her the park ambassador. Everyone knows her by name, and I can hear people while I'm walking all the way across the park calling her to get her to run to them. Well, after I watched how she was with people at the dog park and really everywhere that we go, I decided to go through training so that she could be a therapy dog. So we go to the hospital every week now to visit patients, but honestly, we spend more time with the nurses, doctors, EMTs, therapists. I can't tell you how many times I hear people say, I really needed this today, or this made my day, especially since the pandemic started. So this is one of the treasures of holiness I discovered in the trivial and mundane event of going to the dog park every day. So I wanted to show you a picture. This is Joey at work in the emergency room at the hospital. So you can see how she might make people smile. So I want to talk a little bit now about this third quote that I've picked out about daily life. Daily life challenges our attitudes and actively brings to consciousness through events what is passively brought to consciousness in the purification of the unconscious during centering prayer. I find this quote interesting and challenging. So we know that when we consent to God's action within, we're consenting to the divine therapy. And we may think in our interior life that we've resolved some issue, only to be confronted with an emotional outburst when we're triggered by something from the unconscious. So as we undergo this purification that Father Thomas talks about, we become more aware of our attitudes towards life and how we're reacting to people, events, and circumstances in our daily life. Without these experiences in daily life, we wouldn't see so clearly what continues to block us in our relationships and with God. It's up to us to decide if we're willing to consent to being transformed in and through the experiences of daily life. So I want to start now to look a little. Did you want to see Joey again? She's so cute. Anyway, I wanted to start now to look a little more closely at how daily life challenges us and what we can do about it. But first, I want to ask you if you saw the animated movie Inside Out. So this image on this slide is the animated versions of feelings that we all experience going on inside the boy's head in the movie. So it reminds me of how our emotional life so often runs us. So here's what Father Thomas says. The gospel calls us forth to full responsibility for our emotional life. We tend to blame other people or situations for the turmoil we experience. In actual fact, the upsetting emotions prove beyond any doubt that the problem is in us. If we do not assume responsibility for our emotional programs on the unconscious level and take measures to change them, we will be influenced by them to the end of our lives. So this is the quote that has probably had the most impact on my life in the past 5 or so years. In fact, it showed up in my book so often that my editor told me I needed to decide where to use it and to stop putting it in there so many times. So anyway, even though I remember hearing this quote a lot of years ago, because we use it in some other teaching that we do in contemplative outreach. But anyway, it took me a long time to first understand what it means to take responsibility for my emotional life, and even longer to actually do it. When I was a member of Al-Anon, a 12-step program for friends and family of alcoholics, I learned from work in the 4th step the value of looking for what we call my part in the events and circumstances in my life. But I think because of how long our woundedness, what Father Thomas calls the energy centers or the emotional programs for happiness, how long our woundedness remains in the unconscious, unless we're being very intentional about it, we simply cannot see our part, at least not at a level deep enough to affect any kind of change. Why do we continue to blame others? I think we learn to do this to protect our self-esteem and ego. And if I wasn't blaming someone else, I was blaming myself, which also is not helpful, because taking responsibility is not the same as blaming myself. It's acknowledging that while I may not have control over some of the things that happen to me in life, I do have control over how I respond. What's so damaging about this blaming and not taking responsibility is that if what I experience in my life is someone else's fault, I'm powerless to change it. I'm simply a victim. So when we experience these upsetting or afflictive emotions, if we can if we can think of them as clues that something is being triggered in the unconscious, it can help us in the healing process. We're also assisted in this by what happens to us when we consent to God's action, the divine therapy. It's then up to us to pause and bring into awareness what's really going on, instead of reacting out of what's often infantile projections. So think now about how empowering this is. I wanted to show you this model that Father Thomas shows us in Intimacy with God, and it's also in some of his videos. I think it helps to describe what I'm talking about. And you'll notice, if you're familiar with this, that I've added this darker circle to represent the unconscious. What's in the unconscious is often what blocks us from being able to take responsibility for our emotional life. And it also blocks us from deepening our relationship with God. So we live most of our life from our ordinary level of awareness, and what's lurking just under the surface is the unconscious, which affects how we react to what we experience in daily life. So that's where our woundedness resides, the energy centers, our beliefs and defenses, and our perceptions. A regular practice of centering prayer starts to penetrate this layer and allows us to experience our spiritual level of awareness. It also awakens us to our true self at the level where we experience the divine presence within. Listen to what Father Thomas says about this. Again, this is from Intimacy with God. We are most of the time out of touch with the spiritual level of our being and allow events to dominate us rather than choosing what to do with them. As we work on this process through centering prayer and recognize the dynamics of the unconscious, our spiritual faculties and true self are being liberated. We are beginning to experience inner peace. We encounter the same emotional reactions we had before, only now we notice them instead of blindly reacting to them. It's essential that we learn to recognize the tendencies of our false self, because only in recognizing them can we change them. We don't have to analyze them. We just have to notice them and let them go. So it's funny, maybe not so funny, how no matter how long we are on this journey, we still have a human condition. So, and I had an experience recently with my sister, who is 6 years older than I am. So anyone who has a sibling that much older has probably had a similar experience. Our whole lives, she's made it clear to me that she knows more than I do. In my whole life, that's made me mad. And I've reacted to it. So, and we have even, her and I have even talked about this dynamic and laughed about it, both recognizing it. So, but anyway, I was just with her a few weeks ago, and she said something that triggered this reaction pattern in me. Somehow I was able to recognize immediately when I felt the anger come up that I was overreacting. And as Father Thomas says in this quote, I was able to notice it, and instead of blindly reacting, I just let the anger move through me and let it go. Thank God. But basically, when Father Thomas says we just have to notice them and let them go, sometimes it's not quite as easy as that. And that's where some of our other contemplative practices can come into play and help us. And I'm going to show you how those practices can help in a few minutes. But first, I want to take a look at how centering prayer liberates our spiritual faculties and our true self. So this slide adds to the previous slide the process of centering prayer, what Father Thomas calls the 7 moments of centering prayer. He says we start to recognize the dynamics of the unconscious. I'm going to try to use my little arrow here to point. The first moment is when we introduce our sacred word, settling into our intention to consent to God's presence and action within. In the second moment, we start to have a sense of God's presence and experience interior silence. So the rest we experience starts to work on the unconscious. The third moment brings feelings of uneasiness and apprehension because our defense mechanisms are lowered. And what we normally repress in daily life at our ordinary level of awareness starts to emerge. As our defense mechanisms relax and the repressed emotional material starts to emerge, in the fourth moment, we start to experience unloading of the unconscious. We begin to feel the emotions that we may have dreaded. So we may also at this point experience psychological insights, but as you know, we recommend that you don't pursue insights during the prayer. However, allowing the feelings to exist starts the healing process. In the fifth moment, we accept or allow the feelings to exist. In other words, we allow the body to feel what we've been avoiding feeling because we repressed it in the unconscious. So acceptance moves us to the sixth moment, which is evacuation. This is where we get rid of what Father Thomas calls the emotional junk of a lifetime. So he often reminded us, and you've probably heard this, if it's coming up, it's on its way out. The seventh moment is renewal, when positive energy emerges, allowing us the capacity to heal. So each time we move through the cycle of the moments of centering prayer, our true self, we're getting closer and closer to our true self in the divine presence within. It can help if you think of this as a spiral rather than a circle. That's why I put this other little picture on the slide. So you can imagine it as a movement to the center. Most of us, I think, have this experience where we feel that we're dealing with the same issues over and over again. But the analogy of the spiral shows us that we're experiencing them at a different level with new eyes. So again, I appeal to your own experience with this as we go deeper to new levels of surrender. At the same time, we experience new levels of freedom, growth, creativity, trust. Each time we come around again to renewal, when divine energy emerges, we become more capable of consenting to the goodness of life. A lot of you are probably familiar with this slide. We've been using it in Denver to talk about the human condition as long as I can remember. Cynthia Bourgeault even uses it in her book, Centering Prayer and Inner Awakening. So I want to spend a little more time focusing on what's inside this yellow circle, triggering events as they relate to our afflictive emotions and commentaries. So this is a little different model of how, when unchecked, our emotional programs run our lives. This idea came to me one time when I was listening to the teaching on the welcoming prayer, and we were talking about what we can do when our buttons are pushed. And I remember thinking, I don't just want to have something I can do when my buttons are pushed. I want to be able to disengage the buttons. So take this in for a moment. Our woundedness, beliefs, perceptions, defenses are often in control until we realize that they're in control and take measures to dismantle them. So you can see the interaction between a triggering event in daily life and really whether it sets off afflictive emotions or commentaries, it doesn't really matter because it will all come into play if we're triggered or if our buttons are pushed. So how do we take measures to dismantle them? I would suggest with contemplative practices. So here's what can happen when we put some effort, or maybe a better way of saying that is put intention into contemplative practices for daily life. So of course, centering prayer starts the process of putting space in between the triggering event and setting off the emotions and commentaries. We talk about centering prayer as an effortless practice, but because it's not just a practice, but also a discipline, we have to actually sit in the chair and do it, which, as for most disciplines, takes some effort. So the same is true with these other practices. You can go to a workshop on the welcoming prayer, but if you don't actually put some effort into practicing until it becomes effortless, you won't understand the practice or how it can be helpful. So these are some of the other practices that are in the back of Open Mind, Open Heart. And you can also learn them, if you're not already familiar, from workshops offered through Contemplative Outreach and also through the Contemplative Life Program practice booklets. But you can see how the practices start to put space between the cogs to keep them from setting each other off. I think sometimes it's helpful to have an awareness of what we're going through when we start down the path of contemplative life, because it can feel disruptive and even make us wonder why we're doing this or if we should continue. But it's so important to the process of transformation that God intends for all of us in life, so that we can be who we were created to be and live the life that we were meant to live. So some of you will remember Father Thomas's teaching on the 4 consents. Marie was talking about this video last night. It's actually on what we usually call the Bernie tape. In that teaching, he says, the very first thing that God asks us to consent to in life is our basic goodness. And most of us don't get that lesson in life when we're meant to, but we always have the opportunity at other times. I love this first quote from Invitation to Love. The acceptance of our basic goodness does not refer to what we can do or do better than others, but to the goodness of our being before we do anything. I think that's a really important message for us to take in. The goodness of our being before we do anything. And then the next quote is from the Guidelines for Christian Life Growth and Transformation in Open Mind, Open Heart, where he says our basic core of goodness is our true self. I've wondered a lot over time why he says the acceptance of our basic goodness is a quantum leap in the spiritual journey. Often when we talk about the human condition, we're referring to those things that cause us trouble in life, what goes on in our unconscious that drives afflictive emotions, commentaries, and sometimes behavior that we may later regret. All of the things that we were just talking about. But also what's in the unconscious that we repress, along with what troubles us, is our gifts and our goodness, the divine light within. I remember what an impact this Marianne Williamson quote had on me some years ago. This was sometimes attributed to Nelson Mandela, but it's actually in one of Marianne Williamson's books. But she said, our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us. Could it be that I'm more afraid to face my inner goodness than any so-called bad thing I may have done? If so, think about the psychological and spiritual burden this can cause. And, we know that psychological healing helps us to feel better and to live a more fulfilling life, but spiritual healing allows us to live a life more aligned with the will of God. Father Thomas says that as we heal, we move towards using less and less of our own energy. And as we become empty of that, the divine energy quickly moves into that space, so that truly our action is God's action in us. In Matthew 5, let's listen to what Jesus says. Nor do they light a lamp and then put it under a bushel basket. It is set on a lampstand where it gives light to all in the house. Just so your light must shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your heavenly Father. In Fruits and Gifts of the Spirit, Father Thomas says, when we are moved by the beauty and example of Jesus's life, we take courage that it might be possible to overcome our emotional programs for happiness that prevent us from accessing the full light of God's presence and action within us. As we heal, we come out from under the bushel basket so that our light shines. Why might it be important for us to become aware of our goodness, to let our light shine, to awaken to the gifts that we so often keep hidden, usually unknowingly? Father Thomas tells us through his teaching that our journey in contemplative life is not a personal journey, that what we are doing is affecting the world. And I think that's hard for most of us to believe, especially in the early days of practice, but we'll take a deeper look at this theme a little bit later. So I invite you to consider your own experience. How in touch are you with your goodness? Are you aware of and are you using your gifts? How do you see yourself? Centering prayer and the other contemplative practices help us to be willing to live with these questions until we begin to discover our responses and live into them. So one of the things that I heard Father Thomas say that's become most helpful to me is that the divine therapy is about making the unconscious conscious. Our gifts and our innate goodness have a formidable obstacle up against the powerful programming of the emotional programs. So healing of our human condition starts with becoming aware of some of this negative programming that our unconscious minds run, for the most part, unchecked and seemingly out of control. It might be out of our control, but it's not out of God's control. So when we consent to this journey, God reveals to us what needs to be healed and either heals it or shows us the path to healing. So we're going to pause here while we're talking about our basic core of goodness as our true self. And I'm going to lead you in a guided meditation that I think helps us to get in touch with the core of our being, with our true self. This is a meditation that I adapted from Adyashanti's work, and he calls it abiding in the I am. So I'm going to explain a bit about the practice before we do it, but I want to invite you to start quieting down and listening. You can close your eyes now while you listen if you want to, or gaze at the image on the screen. So the key to this meditation is to not think about it or try to understand it or to analyze it. So for just a few moments, if you could suspend your intellectual faculties and sense your way into this experience. The idea here is to sense the truth of your being, not to think about it, to actually experience it. So many times throughout our day, we say those two words, I am, and then we attach something to it. So you can think about all the things that you attach to it, things that we think identify who we are, such as our name, I am Julie, a feeling, I am angry, something we're doing, I am making dinner. What kind of work we do. I am a nurse. Some judgment we make about ourselves. I am so lazy. Or some sense experience. I am hungry. So this is the way that we've learned to identify ourselves. When we talk about abiding in the I am, or we might say resting in the I am, this is who we are before the thoughts we have about ourselves create our personal identity, which in turn creates emotional sensations that start a cycle that's not real. I think over time, through the practice of centering prayer, most of us get to this place of resting in the I am, or resting in our true self. But today we're going to put more attention on the experience of resting in the I am. So let's begin by moving your attention into your body. If you're comfortable and you haven't already, close your eyes. Settle into your body. Notice if you're comfortable, and if you're not, make any adjustments you need to. Now bring your attention to your breath. Just noticing that you are breathing in and breathing out. Not trying to change your breathing, just noticing. If any of you have used the breath as your sacred symbol, as taught by David Frenette, you've likely experienced how the sacred breath is an embodied symbol. It helps us to be more grounded in our body. As you start to quiet down inside, gently say to yourself the words, I am. I am. As you softly invoke the words, I am, notice where they land in your body. You may be tempted by your thoughts to attach a description following I am, but just let that thought go and return to I am. No self-judgment, no self-image, no opinion, no shaming, no emotional reaction. As Father Thomas says, no thing. Simply, I am. A judgment or image or memory may arise, but now you can notice that it is simply something created by a thought in your mind. It's not who you are. Notice that you exist with or without those thoughts. Before you create the thoughts, in the midst of them, after they pass through your consciousness. Notice that when your mind is quiet, even if it's just for a few seconds, you still are. Not as a thought about who you are, you just are. Now, as we remain in silence for a couple minutes, continue to rest in the I am. Noticing if thoughts arise, using the breath if you need to bring your attention back to the present moment, invoking the words, I am, resting in the I am. And I'll ring a gong at the end of the silence. So with that sense now of our true self, our being, with no other thoughts attached to it, I want to return to the process we talked about a few minutes ago around the 7 moments of centering prayer. And then what we experience when we add in some of these other practices for daily life. And we start to notice something mysterious is happening to us. So listen to this quote from Open Mind, Open Heart, and notice that it's in Father Thomas's early teaching about centering prayer. Not contemplative practice, but the contemplative state is the purpose of our practice. Not experiences, however exotic or reassuring, but the permanent and abiding awareness of God, the transforming union, that comes through the mysterious restructuring of consciousness. At some point in your life, it could be in the middle of the night, on a subway, or in the midst of prayer. The necessary changes in the nervous system and psyche finally come to completion. The restructuring of consciousness is the fruit of regular practice. Most of you probably know Father Thomas was very interested in brain science. And we had a conference probably more like 15 years ago that brought in scientists who were studying the effects of centering prayer on the brain. And I'm sure you've seen articles about studies done with other types of meditation as well. But for our purposes, I think what's important is that something mysterious is happening to us when we have a regular practice of centering prayer, not just spiritually, but physically and emotionally as well. Our physical brain is being changed. And in turn, our nervous system and psyche are being repaired, so to speak. The necessary changes come to completion. We're not the same as when we started this journey. And again, I appeal to your own experience. You probably haven't had the thought, oh, I must be experiencing this because of the restructuring of consciousness. But I think most of us discover over time that something's different. These are some of the things that you may notice. Less inner turmoil, more interior silence. The commentaries start to quiet down. Emotional swings disappear, or at least diminish. The emotions we do experience are appropriate to the present moment, not triggered by some irrational reaction. I was notorious for repressing anger. So when I did get angry, it was way out of proportion. We can serve others without getting caught up in their emotional pain. So we recognize the boundary between someone else's pain and our own emotions so that we can truly respond with compassion and empathy and set our own agenda aside. We find it easier to let go of troubling thoughts and commentaries that often are not related to our present reality. You know, so often our mind tricks us into thinking some perception that we're having that surfaced from the unconscious is reality, when it's really just our perception. We're more sensitized to the way the divine presence manifests in our lives. We more readily perceive, consent, and respond to the divine presence in action within. So these are things that we can't aspire to or do anything to make them happen. But when we have a regular practice of centering prayer, our brain, nervous system, and psyche are changed. As Father Thomas says, it's a fruit of regular practice. Transforming union is related to this restructuring of consciousness. Father Thomas says that transforming union is a restructuring of consciousness, not an experience or set of experiences. So now our ordinary daily life, subjected to divine therapy through centering prayer and our consent to God's action within, brings us to this. The experience of the transforming union is the way of being in the world that enables us to live daily life with the invincible conviction of continuous union with God. The presence of God is evident without our trying to find God in whatever we're experiencing in life. This state of consciousness is not passing, but a permanent awareness that spontaneously envelops the whole of life. And because of this restructuring of consciousness, divine love can now manifest itself in all our activities, even the most ordinary. Again, this develops over time through our practice. God gives us opportunities over and over again to grow in trust and faith, and until we discover that we're freer from the obstacles of the false self, and that we are transmitting divine love in our daily lives. And keep in mind that this is without trying to do anything. We are being changed. I remember thinking for years that I don't really understand what transforming union means, and that it probably was because I'd never experienced it. But it's really not some mysterious esoteric experience. It's me being transformed by God through the practice of centering prayer into a way of being, a new way of being in the world. I no longer have to try to be anything. I just am. And that's a tremendous freedom. Another theme Father Thomas often talks about is the divine energy. The last few times I watched the Divine Therapy course in the Spiritual Journey series, I was really struck by something Father Thomas talks about around the dismantling of the false self. A lot of energy, it takes a lot of energy to keep the false self going. It takes almost no energy to have a reaction out of the energy centers in our unconscious when we get triggered by something. So think about that. We get triggered and snap, we have a reaction. That takes almost no energy. But then think about the residue of having to deal with how we feel, how the commentaries get going, or how we might have treated someone else. And that takes a tremendous amount of energy. So he says that as we become more conscious of what's being triggered in the unconscious, or even that something is being triggered, and then we experience the healing action of grace, the false self energy starts to diminish. The spirit moves into the space vacated by the false self energy. As we see in this quote, divine energy is tremendous. The energy of divine union has to be expressed. It can be expressed in diverse ways, in patience in a long illness, by intense solitude, by a very apostolic life or ministry, but it has to be expressed. It has to express itself in a more than ordinary level of human activity, because the energy that the divine union releases is tremendous. And it's like the particle in particle physics, returning to the wave pattern from which it came, where the power is much more intense in the wave. This is a movement into plugging into the very heart of the energy of the universe. Notice how he calls this the energy of divine union. So I invite you to think about times in your life when you experience divine energy. Most of us can feel the difference when we're operating on our own energy or the false self energy versus the divine energy. For me, it's less about self, more about service. It's creative. It gives me more energy rather than depleting me. How do you experience it? There's one sentence from this quote that has echoed through me for years now, as I have pondered what it means. It's where Father Thomas says, "We feel that our prayer is not just a privatized journey, but is having a significant effect in the world." This speaks to me probably more than anything, what it means to consent to God's action within, what my role, my action is in the world. So let's listen to the whole quote. Bonding with others takes place as the love of the Spirit is poured forth in our hearts. We feel that we belong to our community, to the human family, to the cosmos. We feel at home in the universe. We feel that our prayer is not just a privatized journey, but is having a significant effect in the world. We can pour into the world the love that the Spirit gives us in prayer. We can plead for the divine mercy for those parts of the world that are being torn to pieces by war and violence. This is an imbalance that needs the kind of love that is born in interior silence as we let go of ourselves and allow God to be God in us. The kind of love that is born in interior silence. This is what we're pouring into the world. I've always thought of Mother Teresa as a model of how a woman of faith can impact the world. But in some ways, it was a discouraging model for me because I knew I could never do what she does. And yet I love and admire her spirit and tenacity. And then I remember something I heard Joan Chittister say one time when she would come across people who were discouraged by how much pain and suffering there is in the world, thinking that my little life couldn't really affect that. But she would acknowledge that we all can't do big things like Mother Teresa did, but we can all do something. So her advice is to do something. Do you remember hearing Father Thomas talk about how our prayer changes us? So that whether we are walking down the street or drinking a cup of tea, we are pouring divine love into the world. And when we take that journey into our own heart and work on healing the false self so that we can transmit divine energy and divine love, the people in our lives and those we come in contact with are feeling that and being affected by it. It's hard for me sometimes when I think about how much division and hatred there is in the world, and I get discouraged. And then I go to the grocery store and I'm able to be present to the clerk who helps me check out. And we see each other's smiles through our eyes since we're wearing masks again. Or I take Joey to the hospital, and after an ICU nurse gets down on the floor with her, I hear her say to a colleague, "Now we're going to be able to make it through the rest of the day." I take the time to go sit on the front porch with my 85-year-old neighbor who's starting to have dementia and is lonely. I sense when a friend needs to talk and I make myself available to listen, setting my agenda aside. I ask how I can be helpful to my community, and when they tell me, I follow through. We usually don't need to look any further than our daily life for those we are called to serve. When we have an intention to bring the quality of love to our daily life, we are serving the people we live with, our families, friends, neighbors, coworkers, really everyone we meet. Working with the poorest of the poor is worthy and necessary work. And I admire and am grateful to those who are called to serve in that way. It's not what I'm called to, but I can still do something. Father Thomas says we do this by transmission, which is the result of how we have been transformed in Christ in our unique and personal journey. It's when we are living our lives out of our practice that what we do, our action in the world, flows out of the divine relationship, out of the love that God is. We see more and more that the contemplative life is not a private journey. And this brings us full circle back to the purpose of contemplative outreach and centering prayer that I mentioned at the beginning, which is to further the knowledge and experience of God's love in the consciousness of the human family. So yes, our own healing and transformation is the first step, but it unfolds in the greater context of service to the awakening of God's love in the consciousness of the human family. I think Father Thomas was inspired by Mother Teresa, much like I am, although I can't remember ever hearing him talk about her. But one of her great quotes is, "Do ordinary things with extraordinary love." And I see almost the same words in this quote from Father Thomas. So we're going to use this quote to start to bring our time to a close with a contemplative practice. So we'll do this as a spiritual reading in the manner of Lectio Divina. So I'm going to read this 3 times, the first 2 times in close succession, and then I'll leave a little more time of silence between the second and third readings. So Visio Divina is also becoming a more popular practice lately. So if you wish, you can also gaze at the image on the screen as you listen. You're welcome to read along if that's helpful to you, or you can just close your eyes and listen. So at the end of the silence, I'll ring the gong and then turn the session back over to Carol. So rather than give you any sort of instruction, I'm going to begin with this simple poem that's sometimes attributed to Lectio Divina. We read under the eye of God until our hearts are touched and leap to flame. We read under the eye of God until our hearts are touched and leap to flame. So let us pray. According to John of the Cross, the same fire of divine love that is experienced painfully in the night of spirit becomes gentle and full of love in the transforming union. The eye of self-centeredness diminishes to a very small eye. The great I am of Exodus looms in its place. Thus, the divine plan is to transform human nature into the divine, not by giving it some special role or exceptional powers, but by enabling it to live ordinary life with extraordinary love. And from John 3, he must increase, I must decrease. According to John of the Cross, the same fire of divine love that is experienced painfully in the night of spirit becomes gentle and full of love in the transforming union. The eye of self-centeredness diminishes to a very small eye. The great I am of Exodus looms in its place. Thus, the divine plan is to transform human nature into the divine. Not by giving it some special role or exceptional powers, but by enabling it to live ordinary life with extraordinary love. He must increase, I must decrease. According to John of the Cross, the same fire of divine love that is experienced painfully in the night of spirit becomes gentle and full of love in the transforming union. The eye of self-centeredness diminishes to a very small eye. The great I am of Exodus looms in its place. Thus, the divine plan is to transform human nature into the divine, not by giving it some special role or exceptional powers, but by enabling us to live ordinary life with extraordinary love. He must increase, I must decrease.
Thank you, Julie, for deepening our connection. As we open up from the deep space you have brought us, let's open gently. Just breathing in the breath of life and holding in our hearts this special grace, allowing our beloved God to work in us as God intends. And we have a break right now.